week, we were talking about the Dead Sea at one point, so I wanted to revisit that just for a minute. James asked a question last week about the Dead Sea, and he was asking how deep is it? And James, you looked that up, right? How deep is that?
1,000 feet.
1,000 feet
About,
deep.
you know, very,
Yes.
Time.
Right.
Yes.
So, isn't that amazing? Look at that. That doesn't look like it would be 1,000 feet deep, does it?
No.
Looks like you could wade across it. But that is 1,000 feet deep. We know that that's fed by the Jordan River and also multiple other rivers. And there is no outflow from there. And yes.
Another thing I read about
Okay.
was because of the way of the evaporation, you don't sunburn near as bad in
Oh, really?
Dead Sea as you would other places.
Really?
It's another layer of atmosphere or something.
Well, I believe that. That would be blocking the sun, right?
Yeah.
And see how hazy that looks there?
Yeah.
All around that? And we talked about that before, you know, because the evaporation, this is the lowest point on Earth, and the evaporation being so great and the heat being so great there, I could see that. That would provide a barrier between you and the sun. Also, Braden asked last week about, do fish live there in that water or anything else? And so looked at that, and it says that only bacteria, very small bacteria, and algae can live in that water because it's so.
Actually, I asked that question.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Hunter. So there's your answer.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Isn't that also known as the Salt Sea?
Yes. Okay. Now let's take a look at Genesis chapter 13, verse 10. There's one other thing I'd like to point out about this as well. Genesis 13 and 10. You remember that Lot and Abraham were discussing about their herdsmen getting in arguments with each other because their animals, their flock of animals had gotten so large that they were having a hard time feeding all of them. And so, because I guess their animals graze near each other, and so Abraham and Lot were discussing how to solve the problem. All right, and so chapter 13, verse 8 says, So Abraham said to Lot, Please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right. If to the right, then I will go to the left. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This is the valley he's talking about. Does that look like that now? Well watered. It says this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go to Zoar. So this land used to be compared to the Garden of Eden and to Egypt. Evidently, Egypt was very lush as well. Okay, and I guess all of the conditions were perfect for, you know, enough rain, enough sunshine, enough all the nutrients that were needed. So that's what this land used to look like. That's what it would have looked like when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay?
They're doing amazing things in Israel, growing, have new techniques and irrigation and even in that sand.
Yeah, they're good with irrigation, even back in these days. You know, they had aqueduct from Mount Carmel to Capernaum, 7 miles worth of aqueduct to bring in water. Isn't that amazing? Okay, now also, let's look at Genesis 19 and 24. Genesis chapter 19, verse 24. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. Okay, we all know that story, right? We know that God was upset about the sin, and mostly the sin of homosexuality that was happening in Sodom and Gomorrah. And so he decided he was going to destroy the city, both those cities in that area. All right, so if you look at this area right here, see this area in here? That's the area where they believe that Sodom was at. All right, so there's different ideas out there, but we do know archaeologists are very sure that this area is where Sodom and Gomorrah were at, here at this Dead Sea area. All right, and this city was very well populated. There may have been up to 1 million people in this area because it's so lush, right? So green. You would have had your crops. You would have had, everything that people desire, right, to want to live. And remember, Lot chose this area, right, to bring his herds to. Abraham gave him that choice. You choose. He didn't pick the lesser one. Abraham said, I'll go the other way. You choose the one you like. So that's where he went.
He made himself rich by harvesting salt.
Did he?
Yep.
Okay. All right. And so in this area, these men that study this have found these brimstone balls. You know what brimstone is?
It's sulfur.
Sulfur. Sure is. Brimstone is sulfur. In this case, they found these balls of sulfur, which is they were nearly perfectly shaped balls in most cases. Today, we have sulfur that are in a ball type shape, but they're about 30 to 40% sulfur. These were 90 to 100% sulfur. And so these balls you could just light with a match and it would burn. Okay? So whenever you read about God raining down fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah, that's what it was raining down. I always was thinking like pieces of wood burning, raining down. But brimstone is sulfur.
Fireworks have a lot of sulfur, and when
Yeah.
you burn them, you smell that.
Yeah, that's true.
You pop them.
And, all right, and so we know that when all this rained down on these cities, that there was nothing but ashes left. Nothing. All right, so it's still like that today, and God wants it that way as a warning to us. This is a warning to us about what hell will be like, and of course, much, much worse. Right? Because the sin was so great in Sodom and Gomorrah, God said, I can't take it anymore. I'm going to destroy this city. Okay. Comments? I'll get back up to where we were last week.
And there's nothing really over there that would produce sulfur.
No.
Not like
And
any.
that sulfur that they found there has not been found anywhere else in the world. And that sulfur was found right where those cities were at. Okay? So it was specialized, I mean, there was so many factors that it would be hard to say that this didn't happen by God. All right, so last week we were talking about the Jordan River. This is where Jesus was baptized by John. We talked about many people were being baptized there that day. You could go up and you could rent you a gown and a towel and go down in the water and be baptized. People are doing that every day. Is it any better to be baptized in the Jordan? No, we know it's not, right? It's just the reenactment of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. That's what's important. But I think a lot of these people thought that it was more significant being there.
Hmm.
And some probably did, some probably didn't. But anyway, that was neat to see though, right there. Okay, so this area here is called the Church of the Beatitudes. And this is the site where Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount, or the Beatitudes that we read about in Matthew chapter 5. As we were talking, Dale and Marvin and I, and several of us talked about, you know, it's them putting churches on all these sites is kind of taken away from it a little bit. You know, you'd like to see it just like it looked then, but that's not the case. And but this site was beautiful, and so I just tried to picture in my mind, you know, this being open land, and the next photo shows you a little better. I think these might have been strawberry patches here that they were growing on the side there. That's the Sea of Galilee there in the background. And so that photo was taken from up there around that area where that church is at. And so on this hillside would have been where the people were at whenever Jesus was speaking to them, the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, so this sign here, it's marking the site of the feeding of the multitude, and also many other works that Jesus performed in this area, miracles and teachings and so on. And we talked before about the Sea of Galilee being Israel's largest freshwater lake, and it's approximately 33 miles in circumference. It's about 13 miles long and 8 miles wide, and it's approximately 141 feet deep. But they took us to this site here. It says Jesus in Tapna. And this area here, what they're pointing out in this photo, can you see the lower photo there? This photo right here is the Sea of Galilee. And what they're pointing out is this triangular area up here. And in that area where all these things took place. And so you have the calling of the first apostles. You have the Sermon on the Mount. You have the healing of the woman with the hemorrhages. You have the healing of the leper. The miracle of the multiplication, as we talked about with the fish and feeding the 5,000. Let's see, Jesus preaching and teaching there in Capernaum is this area. And Jesus called out the woes of the unrepentant there. And then also Jesus' last appearance there at the Sea of Galilee was in this area. So that's a very significant part of where Jesus' ministry was, all these things happened at, up here at this northern end of the Sea of Galilee. Any comments?
Of course, the day he walked on the water,
Yes, that's right. Day he walked on the water as well. Yes. This is an olive press that was there in that area. So here is Capernaum. That's what the sign says, the town of Jesus. Peter lived here. There were 9 miracles in this city. And Matthew chapter 4, verse 13 tells us that Jesus left Nazareth and went to live in Capernaum, which was about 20 miles from Nazareth. And he did this after Satan tempted him while he was in the wilderness. Okay, so if you remember, Jesus was baptized by John. After that, he went into the wilderness to be alone. And after he had been there fasting, then Satan comes and starts trying to tempt him. And so, of course, we know that Jesus didn't succumb to the temptation, and he used the scripture, to refute everything that Satan was trying to tempt him with. And but after that happened, then he came to Capernaum, and he mostly stayed there. That was his home base, I guess you would say. He lived there, and of course, we know that he was going as he was teaching for the 3 years of his ministry. But he would come back to Capernaum quite often. Peter lived there, and he stayed in his home, and so.
Do we know how large of area he may have covered in his teachings?
Well, okay, so I don't know how many miles it would be, but it was, let's see, I was thinking it was 30 miles from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea, and so Jerusalem was more
Maybe
down toward that
circumference of
area.
30 miles or something like that.
Yeah, at least 30.
Away from-
Yeah, I would say closer to 50, mile radius maybe, as he was. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I know all the districts that, there's Judea and Samaria and another Galilee, all three of those he spent time in.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of that area.
I think, 50 to 60 miles would cover the majority of those, if I remember right. But,
We think of the Jews not wanting to travel through Samaria.
Yeah.
And they go around. Makes us think it's a long trip, but probably not as far as we, in our minds, calculate.
yeah, but I mean, even Nazareth to Capernaum was 20 miles. That's a pretty long trip when you walk it. Right? All right, so.
Did they take you to the location of his house?
Peter's house?
Christ.
Oh, no. No, they didn't.
Why?
Because he had no home. He had nowhere to lay his head.
But of course, he lived there. And so, where did he spend the night?
Motel 6.
You can see this.
Motel
Let me
6.
show you here. Okay, you see this? It's going to be hard for you to tell much about it, but the top 3 pictures up here are photos, they think, of how kind of Peter's house was laid out according to the ruins. And it looks like it had 3 levels. And so the lower level would have been more of an area where you could dine and eat, maybe, and prepare food. And then you had rooms, maybe on the upper levels. And we do know that Jesus and his apostles met there quite often, right? And so that must have been a home large enough to accommodate that.
He probably stayed in like followers' houses and probably sometimes out in the outside the city in the
Tents.
tents and
Yep.
camping and
If you watch the show The Chosen, that's how they portray it. Even like whenever Jesus selected his disciples and he's going about teaching, they would travel. And, most of the places they were going weren't a day's travel. They would have to spend the night somewhere. And there wasn't, Best Western on the side of the road. So most likely they camped and, prepared food and that kind of thing, and then went on to the city they were going to.
Remember, the scripture says he had no place to lay his head, no pillow.
All right.
Sorry about that trick question.
No, it's.
I take that to mean he never had a permanent home.
That's
He
right.
was always
Okay, so this is some of the ruins there in Capernaum. They think this was probably ruins of some of the homes, because this is the ruins of a synagogue that was there in Capernaum. And Mark chapter 1, verse 21 through 28 describes Jesus teaching and healing in the synagogue. We know also in Luke 14 through 16 through 37 describes Jesus teaching regularly in the synagogue. This synagogue here, they think, was built around the 4th or 5th century. And so we were able to tour that site there, and that's kind of some of the areas there that we were able to see, but it was a pretty large area, you know, so there was lots of rooms and everything, but around that, that would be kind of like the city center, and around that, you would have the various homes where people lived, okay?
So what exactly is a synagogue? Is that like a?
It's like a church, yes.
It's not the temple where they could offer sacrifices and stuff, was it?
No, but it would be a Jewish church though, right?
A congregation of,
Right, because that's where they were at whenever Paul was traveling, right? That's the first place he went,
Yeah.
to the synagogue, because that would be the believers there, right? So that's where they were going to teach. And we know Paul was going to the Gentiles as well. That was mostly his responsibility. Okay, so now we're on to Greece. And this is the sign at the church there where we worshiped at. It worked out to where both Sundays that we were gone, we were in Athens, Greece. And so this is the church there. And this is the congregation. In the center, sitting down in the blue suit, that's Dino Roussos.
you know,
You know Dino?
never met him, but I've read of him, seen pictures of him a long time.
You know him, Marilyn, right? He was here. He's been here several times to give us an update because we support him. And so he's doing a great work there. This is the people that were there when we worshiped. And you have people from all walks of life. Some people are refugees from Ukraine. Some of them are from Iran. Some of them are from all of that area. Because you know, all these countries are fairly small and they're pretty close to each other. You can get on a train and transport from one to the other fairly easy. And so you just had people from all walks of life and some pretty neat stories there and talking with these people.
What language did they use?
Well, that's a good question. We sang songs in English. We sang songs in Farsi, which is a Persian language, which is comes out of Iran in that area. And then we also sang songs in Greek. So, you know, as long as we all had a version in our language, it's pretty neat to sing like that. If you've never done that, it's pretty neat. We did that whenever we were in Switzerland as well.
Did they have two translators, maybe?
Well, for the singing, no. They had a couple of song leaders, yes.
Okay.
You know, and one would lead in Farsi and one would lead, you know, in English, you know. And then one might lead in Greek and one might lead in English. And so you're singing alongside somebody that's singing the same song but in a different language. So it's pretty neat.
Did you find out how old he is?
No, I didn't.
Just curious.
But Dino used to be a travel guide as well. So the first week, whenever we visited with them, we were fixing to go into the Greece area. And so he started telling us, okay, you need to make sure you look for Mars Hill once you go to the Acropolis. You know, and he starts talking about that. And then he starts talking about these other sites where Paul visited as he was on his missionary journeys. And so wouldn't that be pretty neat to have a guy like that with that kind of knowledge, biblical, plus he's Greek, plus he knows since he's a travel guide as well. And so it was interesting to worship with them. We enjoyed it.
Did you ever really have Iranians in that congregation?
Yes, we did. Yep. They were Christians too. The one guy there, go up. Okay, this guy right here, he preached both Sundays we were there. He's doing an online study out of Lubbock, biblical studies, to become a preacher. He didn't even know how to speak English a few years ago. So he's learned English and the Bible well enough to preach it in a 3-year period. So that's pretty amazing. there was also a group of college students from Searcy that were there. They were going to be spending the summer there, and they were going to be coming to worship there, and you know, just Dino offered to help them any way he could, you know, while they're there in that area. So you have a home. It's kind of like home when you're away from home. You have people there to help you. Okay, so this is the Acropolis in Athens. Acropolis just means high point of the city. And so, especially as we found out in Greece, you know, they are very superstitious about their gods, right? These mythical gods, they call them. And so their mythical gods had to have their temple on the highest point, wherever it was. Didn't matter what city it was, it's going to be on the highest point. And so that's how they did it. This is the Parthenon, which was a former temple that was dedicated to the goddess Athena during the 5th century BC. And so, knowing that the Greeks were known for their mythical gods, Greek mythology is stories concerning the gods, the heroes, and the rituals of the ancient Greeks. The myth, as we were told many of these myths as we were going from place to place. And we heard many stories about these so-called gods. And the story always ended with, this may or may not be true. You just talked to us for an hour about this may or may not be true. But I guess as a guide, that's their responsibility to teach us the history.
Boy, how could you apply that
Accurate or
to
not.
real truth?
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but what it reminded me of, this is another look at the Parthenon. This here is Mars Hill. Okay? Right here, this area right up here is Mars Hill. You can see that it comes down and there's a lower area right here, and you have to walk up to this area here. And it's taller than you think, and you have to realize that we're on the highest point of the city already, taking this picture, and so it goes way further down than it looks like here. But this is the site where Paul spoke to the Greeks about the unknown God, as we read about in Acts chapter 17, verse 22 and following. And so that's what I thought about a lot, you know, and didn't Paul use it so perfectly, right? Because as he was coming through the city, he saw all these, you know, different statues to these different gods. And he said, let me tell you about the unknown God, because they have a statue to the unknown God.
You are very superstitious.
Well, he said, I perceive you're very religious.
And then you've got this site here where they gathered to tell stories. That's what Mars Hill was known for. That's where these philosophers wanted to get together and tell stories to each other. So what more of a perfect place for Paul to go and say, let me tell you about this unknown God.
Where you get the news of the day.
News of the day?
Yeah.
Yeah. Instead of the local store, you know. Back in the day, my grandfather had a store over at Kemp, and that's where all the stories were told there.
Yeah.
You know,
Kinda like what it was.
all the gossip, I'm sure. Who did what?
I kind of always thought that was the beginning of talk radio.
Yeah. All right, so this is the ruins of Ephesus here. We'll have many more to look at, many more photos. Ephesus was one of the cities that had some of the best ruins of probably anywhere that we were at. When Paul was there in Ephesus, the population was about 150,000. And it was a setting for many New Testament events. God did extraordinary miracles through Paul, such that even handkerchiefs and aprons touched by him healed sickness and cast out demons. We can read about that in Acts chapter 19, verse 11. Paul wrote the epistle of 1 Corinthians from here. The 7 sons of Sceva, the Jewish exorcist, they attempted to imitate Paul's power, and they were attacked by the demons because the demons did not recognize their spiritual authority. Remember that? That's Acts chapter 19, verse 13 and following. Many new believers who had practiced the magical arts brought their books and burned them in front of everyone. Matthew chapter 19, verse 19. The total value of these sorcery books destroyed was about 50,000 silver pieces. Now, it depends on what type of silver pieces they were talking about, but that could have been valued in our today's value of over $5 million in books that they burned. And why were they burning those? Remember? It was books on sorcery, right? And so after Paul was teaching them about the true God, they were turning from their ways. And so, books on sorcery, witchcraft, right? That's totally against God. So they were turning away from their false teachings, burning those books, and turning to God because of Paul teaching them. Also, Priscilla and Aquila taught Apollos here. We can read about it in Acts chapter 18, verse 24 through 26. Also, Timothy had his first work here in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and 3. It's thought that the Apostle John and Jesus' mother, Mary, lived in Ephesus after Jesus returned to heaven. We can see that in John chapter 19, verse 26 and 27. Paul may have faced wild beasts in this amphitheater. I'll show you in just a minute. And Jesus directed to Ephesus one of his 7 letters in the book of Revelation. So there's a lot of history here. Okay, here's the amphitheater, the remains of this amphitheater we're talking about. Paul and his companions were taken into the massive amphitheater where for 2 hours the mob shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." That's from Acts chapter 19, verse 23 through 41. Remember, there was a silversmith named Demetrius who had made shrines of Artemis. And that he did that for his living. And so by Paul teaching that these were false gods, there were people turning away from those idols. And Demetrius didn't like that because that was taking away his livelihood. And so he stirred up the crowd. Some of the workers that did the same thing as him, they were all losing their livelihood. And so he stirred all them up, and then the rest of the crowd around them is all stirred up.
I heard a sermon one time. I think it was by Bill Burke that he these amphitheaters and stuff had little souvenir stands outside of them where you'd go and buy. You could buy the little souvenirs that they made, those little idols and stuff. And kind of like when you go to the sporting events today or someplace, they have those little sporting or souvenir stands you can get stuff at.
Yeah.
And then that's
Well, there's many gods and goddesses and so-called gods and goddesses that they have. I bet there were stands everywhere in those cities.
Yeah.
For this one and that one and, everything in between.
Are those stones
Oh, yeah, we go back.
man-made or are they natural? Most of that stuff.
I think they're mostly natural. They might be carved to some extent. I'm sure
They're shaped.
Yeah.
And the reason so many of them are gone is people have robbed stones from there to build other structures.
So something this preserved is pretty uncommon. This one was very well preserved, considering.
Someone stepped in and put regulations.
Yeah. Yep. All right. I just wanted to make sure you realized our bathroom facilities are much better than they had. We looked before, remember, at the latrine and one of the other sites. And so you have a big theater like that, you have a lot of people coming in and out. I guess you have to have a place for that too, right?
That looks like Bucky's.
Didn't
A little
even
nicer than Bucky's.
didn't even
Or
have
Bucky's a little nicer than this.
didn't even have dividers.
We're not that far removed from trains like that. First football stadiums that were built in the 1920s and 1930s, most of them were concrete. Well, the trains were kind of similar to that. The old Parish Stadium and the Innocence Munson Stadium used to have just an open latrine.
It's like a bath. Looked like a bathtub.
So that's
I remember.
we haven't moved that far away from
Yeah.
designs. We have now, but up through the first part of the century, we were still following those patterns of building latrines.
Yeah. That's right. And, in a city, what are you gonna do? Especially a city of that size.
Yeah.
All right, so this is called the Library of Celsus. It's considered to be an archaeological marvel. It's one of the only remaining examples of great libraries of the ancient world. This was from 110 AD.
Is the inside still intact? Looks like
Some of it,
Some of it.
not all of it, but some of it.
But no books.
Steam books, no.
Those columns,
Uh-huh.
is that stone stacked on top of one another, or
Yeah, I believe it is.
they're not solid? It's not just a solid.
I don't think it is. I know a lot of the other columns that we saw, they would have a piece, some of those columns would just be around, and they would have a piece maybe this tall, and of course that's hand carved because it's scalloped, like that, all the way around that. And then it looked like they built the next piece, and you've got to make that match the previous, so when you stack it on top of it, it lines up, right? And so that's what it looked like that they were doing in a lot of areas. And how much does that stone weigh? How did they lift that up? How'd you lift that up higher than the ceiling and put it on the top piece?
Ropes and
Scaffolding, pulleys.
And a lot of manpower, right? And maybe animals too.
well, Israel had to do that too when they rebuilt the walls and all that.
I mean, that was common for building in those days. That's just how it had to be done. All right, so this is also in Ephesus here. I just wanted to show you how far that area is. It's a huge area with all of these remaining structures partially there. All right, so this here is the view from the island of Patmos. This is where John was exiled to in 95 AD. With Brocculus, is what we were told. He had a student with him named Brocculus. It was a pupil of his. And according to what they were telling us, I'll tell you about it a little bit more in a minute. In the New Testament times, Patmos was a destination for criminals and political prisoners. Convicts were allowed relative freedom to roam the small island, but most had to provide their own food and shelter and were guarded by Roman soldiers against leaving. Many died of exposure, violent attacks by other convicts, or starvation.
So he wasn't there by himself then, was he?
That's right.
Oh, I always thought
And
he
he
was
wasn't the
there
best
by
of friends.
thought he was there by himself for some
Yeah,
reason.
that's kind of what I envisioned too. Tradition says that John's friends and followers in Ephesus sent food and other supplies to John on the island, and that's how he survived. We're told that John passed away in Ephesus at about 100 years old of natural causes. The only apostle to die of natural causes.
So eventually he got off the island.
At some point.
Where was that recorded at? How he died?
What's that?
Where was that recorded at?
It's not in the Bible. I think that was in like Josephus' writings.
Neither was broccoli, whatever his name was.
No, it wasn't.
Broccolius.
And they were telling us, let me see here. This is another side of some windmills there on that island of Patmos. Then we come to this church here, and this is the site where the cave was at that they think where John was at whenever he saw the vision that we read about in Revelation. We couldn't take any photos in that cave. They would let you go through this church here, and then you go out the other side over there, and there's a cave there in the side of the mountain. And they get everybody in there. It's pretty tight quarters, and everybody's in there, and you can't have any flash photos, you can't have any light or anything like that. But then they tell you about Brocculus probably being the student of John, and he may have recorded the things that John was seeing. Maybe John was saying, I see this, I see that, I see this, and Brocculus is over there recording it. Of course, those facts we don't know. We don't know that to be true.
Paul often had somebody writing for him.
Yeah.
Because of his poor eyesight.
Yeah, and it wasn't uncommon, to have that kind of thing at that time. All right, this is Lindos, Rhodes. We went to the island of Rhodes there. And the reason I'm showing you this is Paul stopped at this island during his third missionary journey while returning to Jerusalem. We read about that in Acts chapter 21, verse 1. One tradition says that Paul's ship landed in a harbor at Lindos on Rhodes. And another tradition says that he traveled through the island spreading the gospel. But there's no real evidence for either tradition. But we do know these islands are spaced apart pretty well. And so if you were traveling on a ship, they're probably going to be picking up goods or dropping off goods at various islands along the way.
Did you see?
So,
Did you see that island where they went and he got bit by the snake?
Malta?
Yeah.
No, I didn't see that.
It's most likely because any missionary is going to go as many places he can in that locale.
Mhm.
And so, especially on his way, he's going to make a point to stop.
Yeah, well, and he's going to be at the captain of the ship's mercy, right?
Yep.
He's just getting a ride from here to there. And so wherever they choose to stop, knowing Paul, he probably took that advantage of going and speaking to whoever he could for whatever time he had available, right? Not be surprised at all. Okay, this is another view from there. And this is a view from the Acropolis at Rhodes. Remember, that's the high point of the city. So they had to have some type of temple up there to one of their gods or goddesses. And,
It's just, this isn't Ephesus.
That's the island.
Another island.
yeah, Rhodes Island.
Might have been Diana.
Could have been. I didn't look up to see there. And this is a palace of the Grand Master of the Knights of Rhodes. That was an amazing place. James, you were talking about you had seen some things. You talked about the island of Rhodes with me before about the history there, didn't you? And this is one of the palaces on there. This was a huge place. Really neat. Really neat.
Looks like a castle.
It is a castle.
No, it is.
That's what it is. The Grand Master of the Knights.
Right there.
Yeah.
That's not
Yeah. What?
That doesn't look strange. It's like 1500s.
Doesn't look like what?
More recent. The castle's more recent.
Yeah, I don't know what time period that's from. All right, this is Knossos. Boy, we're not gonna get done today either. I wonder if the bell. Have you heard the bell, guys? You did?
Right now
Okay.
we're at 45 minutes.
All right, we'll stop right there. Okay, thank you for your time. We will see about meeting next week, so we can